Hello. So I'm Zoe. I'm one of the fourth years, and I'm going to give my talk today on metabolism, growth, and appetite. If you have any questions, by the way, at any point, please just do stop and ask me. I'm very happy to be interrupted. So I'll just give you sort of a brief overview of what's important to know for this topic and some of like the important research that you might be asked about. And then at the end, I'll have a couple of questions. I'll try to keep it brief because I know I am very late, and also this is 7 p.m. on a Friday. So I'll just get stuck into it. So as I said, I'll just give you a brief overview at the beginning. So food intake and energy expenditure must be balanced to maintain a constant body weight. And this is regulated by the central nervous system and its associated neurons and hormones, which govern feeding behaviors and energy and metabolism. So as we see here, we've got catabolism and anabolism. I'm not going to go into sort of the basics. You've probably been bored to death about this, but we've got anabolism in terms of making up our macromolecules, proteins, polysaccharides, lipids, and nucleic acids, and then we've got our catabolism, which is sort of breaking down those proteins and carbohydrates in order to make our low energy end products. So if you think about it in very simple terms, when it comes to energy metabolism and growth, energy input, energy output, and the balance between those two is what governs growth, anabolism, catabolism, and also feeding behaviors drive all of this as well. So to achieve a constant steady state, several systems are involved. And so the parts that we're really interested in for the purposes of this talk are the brainstem and the hypothalamus. And I'll talk a little bit about brain anatomy in further detail a bit later. But in general, we have the brainstem here. Not sure if you can see my mouse, but it receives information from the vagus nerve about satiety signals from the digestive tract. And the hypothalamus, which is this part here, receives information via hormonal and nutrient input, and also from the blood-brain barrier as well. So together, the brainstem and the hypothalamus communicate with each other in order to understand what the body's nutrient status is. So whether we are hungry or whether we are satiated. And then it carries out these actions to maintain homeostatic function. So whether we should eat more, eat less, and whether we should expend more or less energy. So another important thing to know, which won't be the main focus of this lecture, is that there are other parts of the brain which are involved in the reward system. I'll touch on it a little bit later because that's quite important when we think about obesity. But the brain and motivation pathways, the brain's motivation pathways are tightly linked to the satiety centers as well in the brainstem and the hypothalamus. And this is important when we think about food-seeking behaviors and the perceived level of satiation. And that's important when we think, or satiety, and that's important when we think about metabolic conditions such as obesity. So let's look at the hypothalamus in more depth. So here we have the ARC, which is the arcuate nucleus. And this is the part of the hypothalamus which is involved in processing satiety signals. So in general, we can think of two groups of neurons within the arcuate nucleus. The first are those that are appetite stimulating. And those are involved in food-seeking behaviors. And that involves what we see here in green, so AGRP and NPY neuropeptides. So these are stimulated by hunger. And the second is the appetite suppressing hormones, which is shown in red here, POMC, and those are involved in feelings of satiety. So when we're full, these pathways will be stimulated instead. And also shown in here is the paraventricular nucleus, so the PVN, and that's an important nucleus to which the arcuate nucleus also is very closely sort of aligned with, and they have close communication because the paraventricular nucleus neurons helps to process satiety or hunger signals from the arcuate nucleus itself, and then also signals to other regions of the brain as well. So when we think about hunger and satiety, we can think about sort of short-term things. So within the day, our changes to our hunger levels, but then we can also think about longer term in terms of energy and metabolism and how we maintain a constant steady state. So first of all, when we think about short term, I mean like the hour-to-hour changes in our society, in our feelings of hunger. So that will change depending on food-seeking behaviors as well. And this is governed by a few things. So the first is, and I'll just pull this up as well. The first is governed by how full or empty the stomach is. So the stomach will stretch upon hunger, and then that will stimulate the vagus nerve, and that will then send inputs into the brainstem, and that will stimulate the brainstem to then communicate with the hypothalamus in order to stimulate for food-seeking behaviors and to stimulate that we are, or to give the idea that we are hungry. So the second thing that the stomach does when we're hungry is that the X or A cells of the stomach produce a hormone called ghrelin, and that acts also on the arcuate nucleus as well. And that also stimulates, again, the NPY, the AGRP, and that helps us to stimulate more food-seeking behaviors too. So what happens after we've eaten this food in the short term? What happens? How do we then go from being hungry to then being full? So after ghrelin is released, when we have a full stomach, ghrelin stops being secreted from the X cells, and then instead other gut or intestinal peptides are released, including cholecystokinin, which is CCK, GLP-1, PPY, and other hormones. And these act both on the brainstem and on the arcuate nucleus as well to suppress appetite and to signal that we are full, and then to signal for things such as catabolism and energy expenditure. And I've created a table here to just kind of give a breakdown of the actions of all these hormones and neuropeptides, what stimulates their release, and what is their function after they've been activated. And so hopefully that'll be helpful with revision. I'm not going to go through all of it. So what happens then in the long term? So I've told you what happens in the short term, day to day. What happens in the long term in terms of keeping our stores of energy? That's mainly regulated by the amount of fat that we have in our body, the fat to muscle ratio, and the so essentially that will govern the that's governed by the adipocytes in the adipose tissue, as well as hormones produced by the pancreas, including insulin. So first talking about adipose tissue. So long-term regulation, as I said, is dependent on adipose tissue. And if there is generally a low body fat content or a high muscle to fat ratio, then we'll have not that much adipose tissue. And because adipose tissue produces leptin, and leptin is a hormone that signals for feelings of satiety, if you have low amounts of adipose tissue and low amounts of leptin, then those states of your body will sort of go signal for food-seeking behaviors and will signal for energy conservation. Whereas on the other hand, if there is a high amount of adipose tissue in the body, then there'll be a high amount of circulating leptin, and therefore this will create the feeling of satiety and will try to go towards more of an energy expenditure state. Now, this might seem a bit counterintuitive at first because I said this, and it might sound a bit weird because if we think about obesity, for example, you might think that if someone has a higher adipose level and a higher leptin level, it sounds a bit counterintuitive to say that they would have more energy expenditure, and that's because when we think about things such as obesity, we go towards the level, in some cases, not all, of leptin insensitivity, whereby this leptin is actually not sensed by the hypothalamus or the arcuate nucleus. And so you can have instances where there are high levels of circulating leptin, but that's not sensed by the arcuate nucleus, meaning that the satiety signals aren't picked up, and so there's a constant feeling of hunger, and that sort of drives the need to eat more. And that's one of the theories as to how leptin insensitivity leads to further obesity. But it should be said that even though leptin insensitivity has been found in quite a lot of studies to be a driver for obesity, it's not really thought to be sort of the sole main reason. And there's actually only sort of a few models and where you can see leptin insensitivity being an actual sole cause or sole driver for obesity, and it's usually in sort of genetic disorders whereby there's an actual mutation to leptin or a leptin receptor, and I'll talk about that a little bit later as well. So the other thing that governs our long-term metabolism is the level of insulin, because insulin also governs feelings of satiety. And I've said here that it's increased in the elevated blood glucose states and in the fed states. And what it does is that it decreases appetite long term. But obviously also in a similar light in obesity, if there is insulin insensitivity, then we're not going to be able to regulate our blood glucose level. So that's just a summary in terms of what we have with fed state, the fasted state, and the differences what we see in obesity. And I'm going to go a little bit further into the models that are important to know for this topic. I've left a couple of slides here in between that someone who does also tutorials has kindly given me. So I will leave this in for your own revision. And I'm aware that I'm grossly over time. So I'll leave this here. And if you sign the feedback form after, that you will get these and be able to look through them at your own pace, because these are just different ways of describing the things that I've just mentioned beforehand. So any questions so far? If not, I'll crack on and I'll talk about the mouse models, leptin and ghrelin, that you might have come across. So the studies that are important to know regarding leptin, ghrelin, and obesity involve knockout mice studies. So these are the two mouse studies that I'm talking about here. So as I told you already, leptin is a signal for long-term lipid store, because it's a signal for how much adipose tissue we have and how many adipocytes we have. And it's thought to control both appetite as well as metabolism. Leptin is produced in adipocyte tissues, and it leads to the idea, you might have heard of the set point theory, which suggests that a certain size of lipid store is almost protected by the body. So even if there is long-term weight gain or weight loss, particularly when it comes to weight loss, over time, the body will try to set itself back to its original state. So someone could have had a lot of energy expenditure, perhaps due to illness, and they may have had a lot of adipocyte loss in terms of the fat content. But then over time, there's a set point theory which suggests that the adipocytes will then fill up and actually try to correct this loss of fat storage and go back to sort of the natural medium that the body has beforehand. So this theory was actually also created due to these knockout mice studies, because you can see that there is a vast difference between wild type mice and the knockout mice regarding leptin and regarding sort of adipose regulation, so to speak. So on the left-hand side, leptin was discovered in the OB mice, where these OB mice were knockout mice that had the leptin itself knocked out. And as you can see, there was a complete dysregulation of satiety signals, and so therefore these mice just never had the sensation of feeling full, and so they would eat and eat and eat. And then similar thing here. The DB mice, which are the mice that were knocked out for the leptin receptors, also had a similar thing in which the leptin was circulating, the leptin actually existed, but it just couldn't bind into this receptor, meaning that there was leptin insensitivity as well. And so both of these mice were obese. They exhibited hypogonadism and hyperinsulinemia. These are that's the sort of classical triad that you see in leptin, in complete sort of leptin knockouts or leptin receptor knockouts. And it was only later when people started to think about leptin in terms of its role in human obesity. And it was only later where leptin mutations were discovered in sort of rare monogenic forms of obesity. And that does exist in humans. There are mutations in either leptin or the leptin receptor itself, which lead to severe early onset obesity in children as a result of hyperphagia, which can be treated importantly with leptin injections. So these children can sort of live a fairly normal life. So a different way into looking at these studies is look at different mice models where we think about how we can classify how leptin and ghrelin interact or actually communicate with the arcuate nucleus of the hypothalamus. So as I said to you beforehand, that both ghrelin and leptin are important in having a conversation with the hypothalamus about feelings of fullness and satiety. So if we are to do studies where you have lesions to the lateral hypothalamus, sorry, just wanted to double check that I'm Okay, yeah. So the lateral hypothalamus is where you have more of the signals of ghrelin interacting. If you have a knockout or an ablation to this part of the hypothalamus, then ghrelin can no longer have its action, which means that even though ghrelin is circulating, it can no longer contact from the stomach onto the hypothalamus to say, oh, the stomach's empty, I really need to eat. So therefore you see in mouse A, you see quite a skinny mouse, because even though the mouse hasn't got anything in its stomach, and even though ghrelin is circulating, you haven't got the arcuate nucleus, which is the part of the arcuate nucleus which is responding to the ghrelin. And then conversely, if you were to do the same thing to the parts of the hypothalamus that responds to leptin, and in just the same way of the previous studies here where you have leptin insensitivity, if you're just to ablate the part of the hypothalamus that responds to leptin, then you get the same picture where leptin is circulating, but it's got no receptor to bind to because you've ablated that part, and therefore you get quite obese mice. And the last thing, and so actually that sort of gives us this picture of our balance between leptin and ghrelin, whether we go towards hunger or satiety. And that's just a nice overview just for your own revision. And I've put here a very sort of brief overview, and I think it's quite useful for revision just to kind of get to terms with where leptin and ghrelin are produced and where they act, what vagus stimulation does in terms of hunger and satiety, and then all of the intestinal hormones as well. I think that might be useful. I'm not going to read out a table to you. I'm not sure how useful that would be for you right now, but hopefully when this comes around to revision time, that might be helpful for you. And the last thing I want to talk about in this lecture is the concept of adipokines, particularly when we think about obesity. So adipokines are these types of cytokines, which are signaling molecules that are secreted by adipose tissue. So the more adipose tissue that is present in the body, then particularly the more ability of these adipocytes to be able to create adipokines. And adipokines play a really important role in interplaying between adipose and metabolic homeostasis. So, for example, in the context of obesity, if there is dysregulated adipokine secretion, this can contribute to chronic levels of low-grade inflammation via activating nearby recruited macrophages, and that can result in those macrophages secreting cytokines and cytokines themselves and interleukins and TNF alpha. And this creates this pro-inflammatory response, which results in further issues such as insulin resistance, because TNF alpha, as you can see here in this diagram, is an inhibitor of insulin production. So you can see here that, as I mentioned beforehand, with a higher level of adipose tissue, you may have of leptin resistance, but you will also receive, may also experience insulin resistance, and that's from this adipokine macrophage inflammation pathway, whereby you have TNF alpha, which is inhibiting insulin production, and again, also just to hammer home insulin, I mentioned it on the earlier table, but I don't think I actually said it. Insulin is incredibly important in allowing glucose to go into cells via recruitment of these GLUT4 transporters. And so we have a situation where there's a really fine balance between allowing glucose to come into our cells by having enough insulin, but then if we have more adipocytes and more inflammation, then that might hinder this insulin production and therefore hinder glucose from being taken up into cells. And that's why you have a level of hyperglycemia in some patients who are insulin resistant, alongside obesity in some cases. So that was a whistle-stop tour, and the reason why I've gone quite quickly is because I have a few questions, and I thought it would be quite nice to go through these Vivox questions. I've put the Vivox ID up here, and if you would like to sign in and answer the questions, we could go through them. At this stage, I always found it more useful to just try a few questions, see if I was getting things right, see if I was getting things wrong, and then after sort of look back at the slides and digest it for myself, if that sounds good. So I will also log into Vivox and just wait for you all to sign in. Oh, I just saw a question. So, how do adipocytes stimulate the macrophages and why do they do so? So macrophages are sort of resident around the adipocyte pool. I must say that I'm not an expert on this, but from my understanding is that you've got in many organs, so like for example, in the liver, you've got the Kupffer cells, which are just specialized types of macrophages. You have a similar thing in adipocytes. And I think with increasing levels of adipokines or increasing pro-inflammatory responses, just having a high level of lipid store in the adipocyte itself is thought to be pro-inflammatory. That can attract more resident macrophages, and then that sort of trigger the cascade, if that makes any sense. I don't know if that helped, but just think of it as a sort of like there are resident macrophages in quite a lot of places, but the second that you kind of start tipping towards a pro-inflammatory state, like for example having more lipids in the adipocytes than usual, then that can create the macrophages to secrete TNF alpha. Hope that helps. Yes, so well done. I see that a lot of you have answered the question. So well done to the 81% of you. I will go on to the next slide. Oh. Yes, hepatic insulin resistance. So I will now go on to the second question. I'll give you a couple more minutes because this one's got more of a mixed response, so I'll talk it through. Okay. So the answer is increased insulin secretion. So and well done for the 72% of you that got it right. So if we just go back to the table, so GLP-1 is actually I didn't say this, and so my fault, I didn't actually say it, but it does decrease appetite and it increases insulin release. So importantly, some of the new drugs you might have heard of, like the Wegovy, Ozempic types of drugs, are GLP-1 agonists. So they essentially mimic GLP-1 and they help to secrete more insulin in people who are type 2 diabetics, because it's thought that it helps to increase the glucose-stimulated insulin secretion. And if we look at back to these cells, essentially helps this process and helps just move and drive more glucose into the cell by increasing the amount of insulin that we have. I hope that makes sense. And it doesn't increase the sensation of hunger because if it increases the amount of insulin available, we know that insulin is a marker of fed state, so actually will decrease our appetite. So hopefully that will explain. And also it doesn't increase for the couple of you that said increased gastrointestinal motility. I can understand why you've said that, because it's sort of coming from the intestines. It's sort of, as food goes through the intestines, it stimulates GLP-1 secretion, but it's not as in the GLP-1 stimulates or increases the motility. Really, it's more of so that the motility is like a trigger for GLP-1 secretion. Yeah, it's a couple of questions in the chat. Okay, so sorry for another question. Why, don't apologize. Why does increasing glucose uptake decrease obesity? So if we have, I think it's a good question. Let me just think it through in the most simple way. So I think it's okay. So if we have an increasing, so it's not, I would say maybe, okay, correct, my apologies if I said increasing glucose uptake will directly decrease obesity. I think it would more so be like increasing glucose uptake is important in having intracellular glucose, so we don't have really high amounts of circulating glucose, because that's sort of dangerous in terms of, can cause diabetic neuropathy, it can cause diabetic ketoacidosis. It can cause all the symptoms of diabetes, such as thirst. So in terms of managing symptoms, I think that's important, why we need to have normal blood sugar levels down. But then also we want to have a relatively balanced level of glucose in your body in general, because you want to be feeling, you want your patients to feel like they're in the fed state, as in, for example, with the GLP-1 agonists, if it stimulates insulin secretion, it will make you feel as if you're in the fed state, so it will decrease that level of hunger, so you won't have the constant need to eat, like some patients with, for example, leptin insensitivity or leptin insensitivity will have. So it helps just to regulate that feeling of intense hunger, and helps you just sort of to regulate that, if that makes any more sense. And then, yes, the question of how does Ozempic help people lose weight is that secretion of insulin. It's if you're stimulating insulin secretion, then you're going to feel fed all the time. You're going to feel like you're in the fed state, and that's going to send the signals to the hypothalamus saying, "Oh, I'm full. I don't need to eat." And even if you haven't eaten, then it will stimulate that feeling more. And so it's more of a sort of appetite suppressant in that way, in terms of via regulating insulin levels. But it's quite interesting to see how it's taken off as a weight loss drug, but it still works by the same mechanism. It's all working on the levels of insulin in the body, and therefore it will make you feel like you're in the fed state, if that makes any sense. Sorry, that was a bit long-winded. My answers, but I hope that makes sense. If I haven't answered it directly, if you want me to re-explain, please do let me know. So I just want to make sure that I'm not. Okay. So the third question is here. I'll wait a couple more minutes. Okay, Yep, well done for those that said insulin. So yeah, it's kind of essentially what I was saying beforehand. If you have higher insulin, then you're going to increase your feelings of fullness, and over a period of weeks will decrease body weight. Exactly how Ozempic works. For those that said ghrelin, a ghrelin is essentially the opposite way around. So ghrelin, if you were to give someone ghrelin, it could be essentially the opposite of Ozempic, because ghrelin stimulates the feeling of hunger. So actually will probably increase body weight over time, unless you're super resistant, super able to go past that feeling of hunger that ghrelin gives you. And NPY is also just the neuropeptide that ghrelin helps to increase. So for the same reason, neuropeptide Y wouldn't be incorrect. But well done. That was majority of you that got insulin. So I'll just go on to the next question. I must say this is a little bit tricky. I can understand why you might be a bit confused on it. But well done to those so far. I'll leave it a couple more minutes. Okay, so the answer is ghrelin. And I can totally understand why. So well done to those who said ghrelin. I can totally understand people said neuropeptide Y. So the key to this is actually the question, which administration of either which of the following, either centrally or peripherally. And if we think about what ghrelin is versus what neuropeptide Y is, that will help us to answer the questions. Because as I mentioned beforehand, ghrelin acts on neurons in the hypothalamus to increase neuropeptide Y, and that will help us to have the feelings of hunger. If we think about what ghrelin is a hormone. And if we think about what neuropeptide Y is, it's a neuropeptide. If you're going to administer that centrally or peripherally, you're not going to have the same effects of that you do when you have ghrelin injected. So for example, if you inject, I'll just go back and I'll show you the we've got neuropeptide Y, which is sort of mostly working in this region here. And if we're thinking about actually, I don't know, an injection into a vein of a mouse or a rat, that's when we're going to start seeing these systemic responses, because ghrelin is actually going through the circulation. That's the thing that's going to be going from the stomach up to the hypothalamus. So that's why it's on a technicality here, but it's just sort of testing your recognition of what is a neuropeptide versus a hormone, and kind of seeing systemic versus local effects. So I'm just gonna go forward. Oh, sorry. Okay, so I'm going to open up the next question. I've only got a couple more questions to go, so. Well done. Well done for those that said the arcuate nucleus. Vast majority of you. That's something that I'm banging on about a little bit too much. But yes. And then kind of going on from this question, what is the following? What is so going on from the arcuate nucleus? What else targets the arcuate nucleus out of these? Essentially still asking about the arcuate nucleus. Well done again. Yes, for the vast majority that said leptin. Again, those that said ghrelin and NPY, just the other way around. It stimulates food intake. I know it's quite hard to get your head around sometimes. I definitely was in the same boat. But the way that I think of it is ghrelin is like a little hungry gremlin, so it'll make you feel hungry. And then leptin is just the other one. So if that helps you, that's what helps me to remember it. But well done for those that got it correct. I've got a question that's not actually on the VVox. It's a sort of a fill in the blanks, and with every slide you get the answer to the dots that are here. It's quite hard to do in a group setting, so I'll just leave them for now, and you can go through them in your own time after you've got the slides. So I'm going to leave this here. If you have any more questions, then please do feel free to say it in the chat now. If not, I'd be really grateful if you could scan the QR code and you'll get the slides with the rest of the questions, because I'm conscious that I started pretty late and I also don't want to run over, particularly because you were also patient with me at the beginning. If there's anything else that you want to ask me, if you don't want to ask now, you can feel free to email me. I'll be more than happy to help. But yeah, thank you very much.